or that sense that we sometimes have. I think this is a very human feeling of meeting someone, a perfect stranger, and thinking, I know you, I
Mhm.
know you. Or I don't want to know you. I mean, it can go both ways, but there's like something in the history or in the sort of the ineffable connections between us that I was really interested in exploring, and I think found its way into Signal Fires.
Welcome to our first Book Reporter Talks to interview of 2023. Yes, folks, this is the first one. Our guest is Dani Shapiro, and we're going to be talking about her novel Signal Fires, which was one of my 2022 Book Reporter Bets on selections. Absolutely love this book. I'm going to read what our reviewer, Harvey Friedenberg, had to say about it. Signal Fires is a nearly perfect blend of engrossing story and serious character-driven fiction. Given the arc of Dani Shapiro's literary career, that's hardly a surprise, but it doesn't make it any less gratifying. And I think that really does sum it up. And with that intro, welcome, Dani. So nice to have you here.
Thanks. It's so nice to be with you.
So this is your first novel in 15 years. So I'm going to just start out with that. Why so long between novels? It's not like you didn't write in between, but why take a break on writing a novel?
I didn't intend on taking a break, or certainly not that long a break. I sort of veered into memoir writing for reasons that were baffling to me at the time, which I now understand a lot better. I think I was always, as a writer, even when I started out with my first early fiction, I was always writing about family secrets in some way or another. I was always really obsessed with, the corrosive power of secrets and what happens to people when they keep them, what happens when they're kept from us. And then and I was writing about that in my fiction, but then I also began to explore in some way or to make an inquiry into my own life, because I had the sense that I had been raised um, um, amidst secrecy in some way, and I thought I knew more or less what that territory was, but it turned out, and I discovered this in 2016, that the dad who raised me, my beloved father who died when I was 23, had not been my biological father, and that had been something that my parents knew and had kept secret from me all my life. So that explains, as far as I'm concerned, the 15-year gap
Mhm.
between novels, because in some way, subconsciously, I was digging. I was trying to understand something that I apprehended, but I couldn't quite touch.
Mhm.
And and so that the return is, to me, this is now really not surprising. The return to fiction was after I finally had uncovered what had been troubling me and confusing me all my life, and was able to write a book about it, my last memoir, Inheritance.
Mhm.
And in a way, when I was writing Inheritance, and then when that book came out, I had this feeling that I'd come to the end of a certain body of work. I
Mhm.
didn't know what that meant, but I felt like my memoirs should all be published together in a boxed set. And it didn't mean I would never write memoir again, but
Mhm.
certainly that period of time was complete for me. Um, and then I returned to fiction, and I didn't make a decision to turn to fiction. It really, at the beginning of the pandemic, which also signified the end of my book tour for Inheritance, because I'd been on the road for that book for over a year. Um, I had begun 15 years earlier a manuscript of a novel. I had begun, I'd gotten about 100 pages into it, and I realized that I lost the thread. I knew the characters so well. I loved them. I loved the work that I had done, but I ran into a wall.
Mhm.
And early in the pandemic, I was cleaning out my office closet, literally the door that you like see right behind me. And there it was. This pile of 100 pages was sitting there, and something just said to me, sit down and reread these pages, which is not something that I would ordinarily do. I don't like rereading old work, especially old work that I've discarded and put in a drawer. But I did, and truly had a eureka moment that this was that I needed to return to these characters. It was like they had been like Rip Van Winkle, like they had been sleeping for all these years, and I had been growing and growing as a writer and growing as a human being. And like they were ready for me and I was ready for them. And I suddenly knew what I needed to do.
And it's really interesting because we have those moments where something just needs to go someplace else. It just has to be sheltered over someplace else. We're just not there. We're not, but telling your story, I have to read Inheritance. I confess I have not read it yet, but I am really interested in that whole story of who is my family? Where was I? Where did I come from? Who was my father? Who was it? What happened? My mom has this really interesting history. She passed away in August, and with her went this story of her father was the only one who left Italy and came to the United States. And years ago, she went back to the village where her father lives, where everyone still lives. And I said to my mother, my journalism background is, Mom, why did he leave? She goes, I didn't ask. And my sons and my husband and I have decided we're going back and we're going to ask the question because everybody still lives there. They've done well. They have apartments in Rome. What happened? Where's that key to the story that only one person came to the United States? And we want to unlatch it. And maybe my mother didn't want to know the answer, but we do. So I know that longing thing for you of like, who's going to approach it? How are we going to do it?
Yeah, well, and that's a great story. I'm so excited for your family that you're going to do that. That's amazing. But I think that mystery for me also really informed a lot of what I ended up writing about in Signal Fires in a very kind of mysterious way, which is, when I came to know that my father hadn't been my biological father, and I had a period of time of not a very long period of time, because I was able to discover who my biological father was very quickly. But in that period of time, anyone could have been my father, right? And the feeling of you could brush by somebody on the street and they could be of profound significance or importance to you, but you wouldn't know it. Or that sense that we sometimes have, I think this is a very human feeling of meeting someone, a perfect stranger, and thinking, I know you, I know you. Or I don't want to know you. I mean, it can go both ways, but there's like something in the history or in the sort of the ineffable connections between us that I was really interested in exploring, and I think found its way into Signal Fires in a completely fictive form, but that gelled for me, that I was able to.
And that longing of family is going to come up so much with one of the characters to me. And I will get into that. But, the book is opening with this accident in 1985, where 17-year-old Sarah Wilf tosses her car keys to her brother. They both had something to drink. They jump in a frame with this girl, Misty Zimmerman. They start driving home. This terrible accident right on their property. Oak tree, she's killed, Misty's killed. And all of a sudden the family says, we're going to keep this a secret. Like we all are going under like the cone of silence at this moment. And we're sort of not going to speak about this again. We sort of know what happened, but it's this dangerous secret because when you do something like that, it's going to have these ripple effects. Same thing as when you found out who your father really was. There are ripple effects that happen of what goes on like later on. And I feel like starting the story there, starting with a lie, starting with an accident and a lie, and something that everyone will have to bear for the rest of their lives, was such this, whoa, we're right into this story. We're into this family kind of moment. Who are they? And why did they do this? Am I right? Like, did you always have that at the start?
That's such a great question because no, I yes and no.
Okay.
The pages that I began with 15 years ago, all of that was there in the sense that there was this oak tree that this young boy in the neighborhood and all the neighborhood kids called the magic tree because there's something that's special about it, and it's kind of decorated in a different way. And to them, it's magical. And to generations past, it's the place where a tragedy happened.
Mhm.
And that was something that really interested me, was the idea that things happen in a place over generations, and what remains, and what do we know, and what do we not know. But I did not know exactly what had happened at that tree when I started 15 years ago. I had all the characters. I had, Dr. Wilf and Mimi Wilf and Sarah and Theo. I had Waldo and Shankman. I had them all. Very little changed in what I wrote. But when I returned to the book, I knew that in order to crack it back open, I had to know exactly what had happened at that tree. And I sat down one day, and it was like a gift. I say to my students sometimes, like, when it comes out right the first time, just say thank you. It's so rare.
Yeah,
But
right.
I knew that the first word of the book needed to be "and."
Mhm.
In other words, this has already been happening. This has always been happening in some way, which is very thematically true of the book. And I wrote this very intense, like 4 pages or 5 pages of an opening, of almost a prologue, but really a first chapter that was of the accident itself. But I never intended for the novel to be about the next steps of what happened after the accident. And in another kind of book, the next chapter would begin with, it's the next morning, and what do we do? This in Signal Fires, it jumps 15 years into the future, and really it moves around in time. I was interested in the aftermath of the accident, and what happens when, you said, the family decides to keep a secret. I feel like that's almost too rational a word, because I don't think they decide. They never discuss it. It's not like they sit down and make a family decision. It's like, it's simply, if we don't speak, here is this tragedy that happened. The children are responsible, these teenagers. There will be no consequences that are visible consequences. This is a white family in suburbia. The father's a doctor. They're upstanding members of this community. It's 1985. There aren't going to be any visible consequences, but the invisible consequences of what they carry with them without ever airing it, without ever speaking of it, without ever maybe being able to share the burden of it. That doesn't happen. And because that doesn't happen, it alters the course of all of their lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when we have our children, we all have dreams of what they're going to be when they're born. I mean, you do end up saying, gee, what is going to happen? And I feel like this accident tears the family in these many ways. It goes on in this really haunting way, that they're not going to talk about it. You're right. They're not going to bring up what happened, but it sparks like so much sadness at so many moments, because in the back where they're not talking about is where it is. It's like the secrets in your life that were back there, but nobody was talking about it. So there was this pall that goes over everything, even joy, because there's this thing that was back there.
Exactly. Yeah.
But this is also a neighborhood story, as we meet the other family on the block later, as Alice Shankman's baby is getting ready to be born, and Dr. Wilf delivers him. And the baby's named Waldo, which I think is just such a perfect name for who this child is. And did that name come to you right away? And were you trying to express his uniqueness to us right away? Because that's who I felt right away. This kid's going to be special.
Oh, I love that question too. Yes, the name did come to me right away, and that is exactly why. Waldo is, to me, is the beating heart of the book. And I love him so much. And he's a unique, special, brilliant, lonely child, and misunderstood in certain ways, especially by his dad, but by other kids at school too. And yeah, I just that just had to be his name, and his name even really becomes a part of the book in certain ways because and when I named him, I actually didn't know what the circumstances of his birth were going to be. But there's a moment, without any spoilers, where his father sort of looks at him after he's born, and he thinks to himself, like all of those, classical biblical names that we've been thinking about have just gone out the window. He's not an Isaac, he's not an Aaron, he's not a Jacob. He needs a special name.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he does. And it completely is. And his father doesn't understand him. His mother tries to, but Waldo's so bright and ethereal. He's just like, on his own little planet. He likes taking care of himself in a lot of ways as a young age. And there's something that happens towards the start of the book where he says, I know what I want. I know what I need. I goes and gets it. And he just sets out in the neighborhood. And he just sets out armed with his iPad. Like that's what he needs in life to go forward, because there's secrets of the universe that are in there. And I really get the feeling that you loved writing him. Like every time I got to a phrase with him, and I just could tell, gosh, this is a character she's in love with, and for good reason, because he's so different, and he sort of spins the book in a different direction, because the older two are sort of set in their ways at that point, wherever their ways are. But he's that magical child that comes along and hits the neighborhood, and everybody's like, who is he, and why is he walking around like that, and what is he doing? But that's him.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Waldo, because when we meet him, he's 11, and we also meet him earlier in his life. But when we first meet him in the book, he's 11. He's the one whose life is uncharted, who has a future ahead of him. And one of the things that was incredibly satisfying to me in writing him was when I realized, oh, I would really like to know what becomes of Waldo. And I would like a glimpse into who Waldo is at 20 and who Waldo is as a grown man. And I bet the reader would really like to know that too, because when we meet him and he is he's this small boy who's carrying like the weight of the universe on his shoulders in some way. But there's also this sense that he's magic and that he's going to be just fine. But I think for me, it was extremely satisfying to actually, create that and to see that for him.
He's going to have to grow into himself. He's going to have to grow into, because nobody understands him now. Everybody, his friends don't understand what he's interested in. His interests are off on his own space. But what I really love is the relationship between him and Dr. Wilf. It's like the man who helped to be born into this world is going to also guide him at so many different points in the book. I don't want to share and give too much away, but the way they keep coming back into each other's lives and this kinship and bond between them in so many different ways, there's an honesty in the way they speak to each other. And there's an honesty between he and Dr. Wilf that Dr. Wilf doesn't really have with other people. He says what his wife wants to hear. He says what his children, well, they're kind of been disappointments in some ways, and in other ways, they've been huge successes. But this child is this magical person. And I feel that there are older people in our lives that see us the way our parents don't. And that's what Dr. Wilf is. He's this person that's going to let this kid be himself and explore him.
I love that interpretation, and I do think that's exactly right. It's absolutely what I intended, because there are people who can come along in our lives who are not our parents, who are not necessarily family or related to us, or most often are not, who see us, and by seeing us and by mirroring us back to ourselves, by reflecting us back to ourselves, and by being that presence in our lives, can be the ones who save us. And Dr. Wilf is definitely that for Waldo, but I think Waldo is also that for Dr. Wilf at a certain point in their shared lives.
Yeah, the two of them are going back and forth. And then Mrs. Wilf and Waldo's lives come together in a chilling and beautiful way. And just the way the two of them are sharing a very special moment. I don't want to give anything away there, but he plays a very big role in something that happens in her life. Was that something plotted originally, or did that come out organically as you were writing? Because it's just this really, like, you see as the reader the scene coming, but when it hits, it's just still magical.
It was not plotted. I, for better or worse, I'm incapable of plotting. One of my favorite quotes about writing comes from Aristotle in Poetics, where Aristotle wrote, "Action is not plot, but merely the result of pathos."
Okay.
And so if you like, for me, I trust that if I really know my characters and I set them off in action, and I really deeply know and understand their pathos, then plot will ensue. And so, when Waldo takes off with his little backpack and his snacks and his iPad, um, I wasn't exactly sure where he was heading, but I was one step behind him in a way as the novelist. Um, and Mrs. Wolf also is on her own trek. And it became apparent to me at a certain point that they were going to converge, that they were going to, end up um, encountering each other. I wasn't exactly sure what was going to happen when they did, but it all became very clear. And I think also because of the way that I upended time in the book. I mean, originally, when I started the novel 15 years ago, my whole idea was that I was going to tell the story backward in time, and it was a very flawed idea, which became clear when Waldo was born. And if I kept going backward in time, there would be no more Waldo, and that wouldn't do. So into the drawer it went. But all these years later, I understood that I could be in 1985 and return to 1985. I could be on this one night in 2010 where all of these events happen, and I could leave there and go into other periods of time in these characters' lives, and then I could return to right where we left off, and not lose a beat, and that would hopefully be really satisfying to the reader to be able to sort of continue on with the story. And so that also gave me, because I didn't write these passages of time in one go and then divide them up. I wrote a section and then I continued on into other moments in time, other decades. And then when I returned, it was as if I had come to learn more about what needed to happen on that night.
Yeah, where we needed to be, where all the players needed to be that night.
Yes.
Because it's not just one person, it's where everything unfolds.
And it's also informed by their pasts, which I was writing about. And even their futures. I mean, there's some aspect of not exactly the multiverse. I mean, that wasn't a word I was thinking about at all, but really, this whole idea that everything that's ever happened is still happening, and that the past and the future are with us in the present. And so I was learning about the characters in ways that then informed them in whatever present we found ourselves in.
Yeah. The next time you were moving around, I've lived in the same neighborhood now for, I think it's 33 years. And it's really interesting because I think about my neighbors and how much we've known each other in different points in our lives. People next door moved in when their child was like 6 months old. And now he's getting ready to go to college. And the other one is in college. And we've lived through so many things that we know about each other. And we're not in and out of each other's houses. It would only be coming over if you're invited. We talk if you're at the end of the driveway. But by the same token, there's this community that's built among these people. And I feel like I could picture the street where he goes out to get the mail and she goes out to get the mail, and they see the child across the street. And is he strange? And what is he doing? And you observe, but you don't really do anything with that observation except put it in the back of your head. And it's something really lovely about it because there's little threads and pieces of people's lives. Like, when the truck moves over here or this goes there. And I don't know if I'm making sense here, but there's this lovely thing about knowing this little microcosm of a neighborhood.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. I had moved with my family from New York City to rural Connecticut a number of years before I started Signal Fires back, 15 years ago. And I was struck by that feeling of sort of throwing your lot in with all of these other people who have chosen for one reason or another, for their own reasons, to live in this particular neighborhood, in this
Mhm.
particular community. Maybe you have children the same ages or around the same ages, and those children grow up together. And you may not have a lot in common other than those stark facts of, having had kids around the same time, living in the same place. But you are so much a part of the fabric of each other's lives. And then people move out and new people move in, and different generations, sort of on the same street in the same neighborhood. It in partly came for me from the realization when I was like in the white hot center of parenthood, of active, little kid parenthood, that it was going to be a chapter, that
Mhm.
it wasn't going to be all of life. And that in fact, when you look at life and divide life into chapters, the 18 years of, children under your roof, or, 18, 20, 22 years, whatever it is, of children under your roof, in the span of a normal lifespan, that's not the longest chapter. The
Mm-mm.
chapters before are much longer. The chapters after are hopefully long and rich and fruitful. And yet during those years, it absolutely feels, and in certain ways is, like it's all led to this. And then after this, it will all be nostalgia for this,
Mhm.
which I rebel against. But I get. And I was really interested in exploring that. And one of the things that contributed enormously to whatever the book has become is that when I started it, I was in the active parenting stage.
Right.
And when I finished it, I had a son who was, a junior in college.
Mhm.
So, and I was closer to the age that Ben and Mimi Wolf were, which seemed quite old to me when I started it 15 years ago. But so I had a different level of sort of kaleidoscopic understanding of all of these characters. I mean, I was the mother of an 11-year-old boy when I began the book. So the question, who does Waldo become? Who would he be in the year 2020 was of great interest to me. He'd be a college student. Where would he be? How would he be dealing with this very strange, surreal, challenging moment in time that we all lived through?
Mhm.
So all of that contributed, but it really came from that feeling of a neighborhood as and a community as both central and somehow a little arbitrary.
Mhm. And we had some of the neighbors in these last couple of weeks, and we realized we didn't do that for 2 years. Because for
Yeah,
2 years, you were worried about the people across the street or down the street coming into your house and bringing some virus that would kill people. And you think about, really, I said, we haven't seen you in like a couple of years. Like,
yeah,
what's been going on? And to start those interactions again and start chatting with those people who you've seen fleetingly, maybe on Facebook, or you've seen the kids trick or treating or going off to college or all those things. But it's still not the same as sitting down and having those meaningful conversations that you didn't have for a couple of years with people you actually enjoyed and you really
yeah.
enjoyed spending time with.
And
And
you
we
have
have,
this history with.
yes,
You have a
yes.
very interesting kind of history with, because you're not family and you're maybe not like super intimate. They may not be your most inner circle, but you used the word witnessed before. You have witnessed each other's lives. You've witnessed each other's kids growing up. You've witnessed, just the passage of time together.
Mm-hmm. And what's been interesting is we're all very honest about, some people, and I'm sure you went through this with the children when they were growing up, so and so's perfect, so and so's this. We admit every single thing that goes right, goes wrong, this, that, and it's just this very honest way of communicating with each other instead of putting this veneer on top of what goes on. And I've noticed that anybody who does that, we just don't hang out with, because we
Yeah,
just do not have the patience, any of us, to live up with that. And I didn't have girls. And the one mother, I remember talking to us about dresses and shopping. And she's like, oh my gosh, she's, by the time you left, and she would just have to be doing stand up describing what this was like. And I was
yeah.
like, oh, glad I had boys. Glad I didn't have to deal with this. The other thing we've got is Y2K. And I've forgotten so much about, like, I owned a company during Y2K. Was the site going to disappear? What was going to happen? And it's a night that Waldo's born, and it sparked those memories that were just 23 years ago. Like, like the pandemic was a couple of years ago. Y2K is what's going to happen that night, this foreboding. What will happen around the world? Will everything stop? I don't think anything stopped, if I remember correctly. But boy, were we set up for that moment. And the fact that he was born that night was just, that would be Waldo's birth. That's where it would come in.
Yes.
When you're thinking about this Y2K moment of nothing's going to work at the bank, you'll never be able to get money out. Remember, it was.
Yeah. Well, when I first began to write that section, that was still way back 15 years ago. But even then, I had that feeling of, gosh, that was sort of overly dramatic and silly of us. But to revisit it, another, decade hence, and in the pandemic, was really to think it almost feels like an innocent. I mean, I had an aunt, my mother's sister, who was really like an end of the world, person who, she and bless her heart, but she, in her apartment in Florida, she had canned goods piled to the ceiling. She had cash stuffed into pillowcases, and she had gold bricks. She had bricks of gold. When she died, my husband had to go down there with my mother and like transport all that stuff back. Was it even legal to carry bricks of gold? I don't know. But there was like nuttiness around that. But I was thinking about Shankman, and Shankman is a systems guy. He works in a kind of Wall Street-ish kind of situation. He was somebody who was very much thinking about that. He wasn't really worried about it, but it was on his mind. And Shankman's wife Alice was 8 months pregnant or so, and it all just became, again, like you were asking me, was it plotted? It wasn't, but it became so clear that, of course, that's what had to happen.
Yeah. This is like, this is when Waldo's got to be born. And this is when everything's just got to happen. The connections is a theme that I see going through the book. Connections to each family unit, how they interact with each other. Theo and his sister, sometimes they get along. Sometimes it's this push-pull kind of thing. Is it the damage that happened that first couple of pages? Is it, where are they going now in their lives? Are their parents satisfied with where they've gone with their lives? And it was just all these very, very interesting things, because a lot of times parents are playing their success according to how their children have gone. And when Theo is drifting, they're constantly thinking, oh, how are we going to explain this to everyone? How am I going to explain what my child is doing? And I just felt like everybody could not really be themselves. They were like supposed to be these little boxes walking along. And good old Waldo just broke every one of those out of the box. Like, it's like, oh, I'm just going to be me. And this is what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I mean, it's an interesting question about how the Wilf parents felt about their children as, young adults and adults. Because both Theo and Sarah end up with worldly success, both in very, very different ways. But each of them are also plagued, also in very different ways. And I think that there's a bright line that goes all the way back to that night in 1985 and that accident. I mean, you don't get over something like that. I mean, the sorrow for them is that they could have gotten help. They could have, probably had a better outcome in terms of how they experienced that tragedy and their part in it. The one way that they weren't going to have a better outcome was silence, because silence and secrecy that's born out of shame just keeps on getting more and more entrenched, and that's what happened to them. And you beautifully described Ben earlier as somebody who doesn't really say what he's thinking, but he does to Waldo, but he doesn't really to his family. In Ben's case, I think that's out of a kind of kindness, or out of a kind of slightly misguided, love of I just want everybody to be happy, and perhaps this is the best way to do that. But it's really Mimi who cares much more. I wouldn't say about appearances, because I don't think Mimi cares that much about appearances, but she cares. She wants everything to be lovely. And it is. They have a lovely life. And up until that night in 1985, it's a very completely charmed life. And after that night in 1985, it continues to appear to be a charmed life, but now it has something that's eating away at it from the inside. And Mimi does not want to address that. She wants to, sort of stick her fingers in her ears and just go la 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 and have it be, just have it go away.
And she wants to be able to, whatever her children do, she can explain it. The restaurant is fabulous. This is what happens. You can almost see how she will talk about each of these things that happens. When she sits down, she's writing her own script of how she's going to present her children's lives to other people. And she's not presenting her life. She's presenting other people's lives. She's the doctor's wife. She is the mother of these two children. Those are her roles. But who is she? You don't quite know as you're going on.
Yes. No, that's true. I mean, I imagine her to have had some sort of artistic background, but have really sort of sublimated it into marriage and motherhood and, making a beautiful home and, being the volunteer at school and being the one who does crafty projects really, really well and really knows how to wrap a beautiful, Hanukkah gift and, brings freshly baked things to new neighbors and that's her. But I think I don't, it's interesting that you see Mimi as caring about what she's going to say to other people about her kids, because I imagine that's true, but I thought more about what she was able to say to herself about her kids.
Okay.
That she wanted to to feel good about them, and she was going to find a way to do that.
Yeah. She'd done a good job being a mother.
Yeah.
She'd done it. Her job had been well done and well taken care of. And when you sees her daughter with children, she thinks about that. She thinks about what happened in that, scenario.
Yeah.
What's going on there. So why does Waldo's father never get called by a first name? He's always Shankman. Where is that coming from?
For me, he was always Shankman. Almost even his wife calls him Shankman. To me, it was and look, I didn't sit back and think, how do I do this? It's more like it was instinctive, but I felt like I wanted Shankman to be have slightly less than everybody else. And one way of that is for him to just simply not have a first name. It's funny because I'm actually working on the television pilot for Signal Fires now.
Oh, wow.
That's being developed as a TV series. And in the TV series, I've had to give him a first name. And I'm trying to give him a first name that people get wrong all the time. Those names, people just get it wrong. It's like Justin, not Jason or whatever. And
his name is Rolf.
Yeah. And he's constantly being dissed unintentionally by people who don't call him by the right name. And by so many other things, because that's how he walks through life. Shankman is, I think, a classic example of someone who walks through the world with a certain worldview, which is to say bitter and negative and comparative and feeling like, people got more than he got. And because that's the way that he walks through the world, that's the world he walks through. That's reflected back at him again and again, because that's how he sees the world. And, to speak to Waldo's specialness and uniqueness, Shankman it's not possible for Shankman to see his son as special and unique. He sees his son as different, and because of his worldview, thinks that that's going to mean that Waldo isn't going to have a successful life, because uniqueness and difference doesn't get rewarded as far as Shankman's concerned. Normalcy, quote unquote, is what gets rewarded. And so all Shankman wants is for Waldo to be, quote unquote, normal, which is something that Waldo is never going to be. And so Shankman, and this is like to me heartbreaking. I mean, as the narrator, as the novelist, I would kind of stand back and just think, oh, Shankman, like do better. But he couldn't do better. He
Yeah.
couldn't because part of his anger at his son was wrapped up in his love for his son and his wanting what he would consider to be the best for his son.
Mm-hmm. And it would something that wouldn't hurt him in life. He wants him to be safe and happy at the same time, but it's not happening. You know, I love in the acknowledgments when you give a shout out to Jennifer Egan, who, quote, suggested to you over a decade ago that chronology of any sort is boring. I love this. And goes on to say, thanks for reminding me by example that the high wire is the only workplace worth being. And I love that because this book definitely goes to different places in time and it takes you in different directions. But by the same token, every time I was doing some reading online of like reviews about the book or whatever, and everyone was saying, I just love these characters. I love these people. I love traveling with these people. And if it was linear, we would not have had the same kind of story. We needed to jump around. So I say yes to Jennifer as well.
Well, it's funny because I remember the conversation and I remember I was driving and I was like just in my car and I was full of despair because I was putting the pages in the drawer and Jenny is one of my very close friends and I was explaining to her why I was putting the pages in the drawer and what she said was you're upending chronology by telling the story backwards, but you're still being chronological. You're hewing to a backward chronology. Why not break it up? And I knew she was right. And that lodged itself somewhere in me. But I absolutely was unprepared, not capable at that point of doing it. And if I had been capable of it, I don't think it would be the book that it is today because I really did need all of the life experience that I had over those 15 years in order to not just be capable of structuring it in this way, but of having the depth that hopefully it has.
Yeah, because you have to sit there and get to a different point of being a different mother. You have to get to different points in life because all of a sudden you see something. Remember when my kids were little, we were at a baseball game one day, and one of them, we always were really big at the baseball games. They wanted my kid on the team, and he was not very good by his own admission. But he said, Dad's going to coach because he works from home. And you're going to bring books and talk to the mothers in the stands, and they're going to be really happy. So that's the reason we go places. And one of the mothers in the stands one day said, when are they all going to stop being VG plus? She said, at point right now, they're all going to Harvard. Right now, this is what's going to happen with every single one of these kids because they're all here. And at what point do we start doing this? She said, because I'm kind of waiting for it. And we had this really interesting discussion kind of sprung from at one point, because you can color in the lines, you're okay. If you can do this, you're okay. And then the marks start moving around like this. And it was just a really interesting moment.
Yeah, I love that. There's that, that series of books that every, parent in America reads of, what to expect when you're expecting, and then what to expect the toddler years, and it has these charts of, it's as if your kid is an avocado and you're just trying to figure out when they're at the most ripe, of should be able to do X, Y, and Z, probably can do X, Y, and Z. Might even be able to do X, Y, and Z. And, I've often thought, it would be a great spoof. Maybe somebody's done it, but to have that all through our lives, period.
Right.
I actually think Sarah Wilf has a thought like that at some point early in the book, like, for middle-aged women, might be able to, but that kind of looking at, looking comparatively, it's a condition of a certain kind of aspirational parenthood that I was also interested in in touching on and exploring.
Well, when my son was born, they had what to expect when you're expecting, and then they didn't have the first year. And I was like, and now I'm on my own.
I don't have my user's manual.
They didn't do 2 and 3. And I'm like, whoa. We need this like going all the way through. It was very funny because you didn't sort of think about it. You thought about it according to Dr. Spock before that. Now these people are telling you when the baby's supposed to kick and when these things are supposed to happen. And you think about all the ways that we like sort of chart our lives of this should be, and the shoulds just go away after a while. It's like, just go become yourself. This is this. At a time when I feel like there's so many really bloated novels out there, many bloated novels out there, you bring like Signal Fires in this slim, like I think it's 221 pages. Did you edit a lot out to do that, to keep it so tight? Was that a goal of yours, or you were just a tight writer from the start?
It's different with every book, but in the case of Signal Fires, it was a tight book right from the start. It felt to me like I know I don't think I think I cut very, very little. I intuited sort of what swaths of time I wanted to, sort of visit these characters in. Like I wanted to see them at certain key moments in their lives. Um, but I didn't feel the need for a lot of the what happened in between. A favorite book of mine is Virginia Woolf's Moments of Being, and in it she writes about she describes moments of being, which are moments of sort of great aliveness that can be very small. It's not like the greatest hits, just moments of revelation or aliveness, or just a feeling of connection, and everything else she describes as the cotton wool, like the cotton wool of, I mean, we have a lot of cotton wool in our lives. And there are novels, some of which I love, who include the cotton wool. This novel, I felt I wanted to stay with these very intense moments and have those moments themselves, in a way, be like a constellation.
At the same time, you're the host of a podcast called Family Secrets. And I want you to tell your viewers and listeners a little bit about that. But what I also feel is when you're hearing people's stories, they're microcosms of stories. They're not telling you every single thing in their lives. I was listening to a couple this morning in prep for this, but they're telling you the things that matter, the things that moved their personal stories along. Am I making sense here with what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
no, perfectly. So when I interview a guest on Family Secrets, many of my guests have written books. Some of them have made films, and some of them not at all. I mean, I don't look for that. It's just that's what sort of comes my way. And also, those are people who are adept and comfortable narrating their own stories. But to me, my job as the interviewer is to kind of keep them on a chronological line of storytelling that specifically has to do with the secret that we're exploring. So that there are times it's been a very interesting form of storytelling for me, because it's highly produced, the show, and I edit a great deal. And sometimes I'll stop and say to my guest, "We're going to get to that. You don't jump ahead to, so my childhood was like this, but then when I was 25, this thing happened. We're going to get there." And it's my job to sort of shepherd them through. But like in terms of the podcast, I started I never had any ambition to start a podcast. It's been one of my life's kind of happy accidents. After I finished Inheritance, and after I made the discovery about my dad and realized that I was the secret, in my family, people started hearing what my book was about, and they started sharing their most intimate secrets with me. Actually, come to think of it, they had already been doing that. People, I was someone who seemed to have a big, like, confess to me sign over my head. And again, never understood why. But I was on the phone with a friend of mine one day who was telling me, who had read my manuscript of Inheritance as an early reader, and she was telling me a story of a family secret of hers, and it was an absolutely riveting story. And she's a wonderful storyteller. And I thought to myself, I wish this could be shared with people. I wish people could hear this. And I kind of went from there to thinking, I wonder if there's a podcast about family secrets. And at that time, there wasn't. This is 2019 when the podcast launched. And I mean, it's been wild. It launched like crazy launch, became a huge hit, much to my amazement, because I had no ambitions in that department. I didn't even know what that meant. And now we're going into our 8th season, which means that at this point, I've interviewed over 70 people, like deep dive interview on the subject of a family secret. And I think that also, in many ways, informed Signal Fires in the sense that I've thought deeply about the ramifications, the haunting, the result of secrets being kept.
And it's like, okay, now what happens when that happens? Where do we go there as a person? Where
Because
do we
they
move
don't
on
go
to?
away. Because
No,
they
they
don't go
don't.
away. The whole idea of we're going to shove that under the rug, or well, it's still under the rug,
Right. It's still there.
or we will never speak of this again. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, and it does go somewhere, and it actually, ironically, begins to grow and build and accumulate more energy for having been like kept silent for so long.
Yeah, the secrets that are swept under the rug all of a sudden become to the next generation of kids, especially. What's going on here? What really happened?
Exactly.
What's the non-story that didn't happen here?
Exactly.
Was the title always Signal Fires for this book?
No, I did not have it. Well, yes, in the sense that I didn't have a title until I had Signal Fires.
Right.
But I did not have a title until I finished the novel. The name for it in my files was Magic Novel, because that's what it felt like to me. It felt like it returned and it was magical, and Waldo was magical. And then I discovered, I read this poem by Carolyn Forche that ends up, part of it being the epigraph of Signal Fires. And it had that phrase, Signal Fires, in the poem. And I just thought, that's it. That's what these people all are for each other. They're all Signal Fires, in the vast sort of cosmos and in the darkness.
That's going to happen. And the cover is terrific. And the cover is really terrific when you see the tree. You know what the tree means. You know what the stars mean. You know, and everything. Was this the first one you saw?
It was. I don't think it's the first one they tried, but it was the first one they showed to me. They were, my publisher, Knopf, was really trying to go for something. And it was very complicated because it's like, nobody wanted the cover to be figurative. I did have, the sense that's like a starry sky needed to be part of it, but a starry sky by itself is maybe not enough. And and it probably doesn't come through on the screen, but those stars on the jacket actually shimmer.
Yes, shimmering. I'm trying to get them to shimmer.
They're really beautiful. I mean, they did this treatment on them that gives them a kind of luminosity. And as soon as I saw it, I knew that it was the one. And at the very, very bottom of the tree, teeny, teeny, tiny, there are figures.
Yes, there's little figures down, which I did not notice till you just said that now. How's that?
Yeah, and how about the spine? The spine is that decorative element on the spine is the rings of a tree.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We had an oak tree come down. Well, it had to come down because as the let's see, the person who took down the tree, I forget what his name is, what he's called. He came in and he says, let's put it this way, it's just like you two. It's not structurally sound. He says it's kind of like empty inside, like just the way we are trying to get around these days as we age. We're not as structurally sound as we were before. So I was like, oh, great. Thanks a lot. Take the tree down. And how much is that going to cost?
Yeah.
But it's, there are moments with trees that you don't want to bring the tree down. But when we took it down, the reason we did was my husband saw a squirrel was living in the tree. Like he saw you in the tree. When they took it down, the entire inside was
hollow.
It was hollow. Yeah. And he feared a snowstorm or something knocking the tree down and takes out half the house.
Sure.
But everybody's like, why are you taking the tree down? I'm like, well, this is why. You don't want it to hit the house,
Yeah. Yes.
But you also narrated the audio, and have you done this for all of your books or some of them, or what have you done with audio?
I've done audio for my most recent books. I narrated, I think the first audio that I narrated was my memoir Devotion.
Mhm.
And then I narrated the others. And then actually during the pandemic, Penguin Random House Audio, which is my audio publisher, um, had me narrate two of my earlier books that that hadn't been in audiobook because it was before audiobooks were a big thing.
Mhm.
But I hadn't narrated my fiction. And it was I wanted to narrate Signal Fires. I didn't want it to have a professional narrator, and I also think because of the podcast that I've gotten quite comfortable with narration, and I think because of the podcast and the popularity of the podcast, my publisher was on board to
Mhm.
have me narrate. But what was really interesting about it for me is that it was actually fun, and I would not call narrating my memoirs fun. I would
Mhm.
call narrating my memoirs going inside of a soundproof booth with my director on my headphones in my ears and sort of reliving, some really challenging times
Mhm.
and all these layers of time and all these different selves that I've been in all of these different ages. Very, very intense, not painful, but very intense experience. And with Signal Fires, it was a joy. I felt like I got to perform a
Mhm.
little bit, not perform the way a voice actor would, but perform just the slightly different rhythms of the different voices. Shankman has a different way of speaking than Waldo does,
Mhm.
than Ben does, than Mimi does, than Sarah and Theo. And I loved being able to do that, and I felt like I could do it because I knew them so well.
I feel like you knew their voices in your head. So to be
Yes,
able to say them, it was exactly the perfect thing to do. And it's so interesting about the explosion of audio. When I meet with my book group, it's 1/3 have listened, 1/3 have read it in ebook, 1/3 have read it in print. And they said when they deliver authors their numbers, it's like this right now. It's like
it
this is
is
the breaks of what's going on. Whereas your audio rights used to be like your rights to Finland or something like that. It didn't really
totally.
matter. Didn't
That is
matter.
absolutely true, and it's differed book to book. With Signal Fires, currently it's more hardcovers, and next ebooks and next audio.
Mhm.
With other of my books, it was much closer to like sort of a third, a third, a third.
Mhm.
Um,
And it may change as summer goes on. It may change
yes,
as the book sticks around because it's
yes.
also, I think, the time of year that things come out. And we really haven't done, I mean, I haven't talked to anybody in audio about this. The thing for me is I never worked in publishing. So all these ideas I come up with, it's just I came up with them on my own. There was no big study done. But I think during the summer, a lot of people are traveling. They're listening to audio because they are traveling. They're
Yes,
sitting on a beach listening. And the books that come out different times of the year, I think, spike in different ways based on what's going to happen,
I
what people
think
are
no,
doing.
I think that's true, and I also think hardcover books make great holiday presents.
Yes.
So that's why, October, which is when Signal Fires came out, is always the big season or the season for books that they're hoping will be big, big, successful, popular books because
Mhm.
it'll move all the way into the holiday season and then beyond.
Yeah.
Whereas in the summer, people are outside and they're on vacation, they're on beaches, they're traveling in different ways. So I agree with you that those habits change over time.
We sit there and we say, okay, well, what you're going to do. But then if you sit at book club and go, the narration on this was fabulous, you should have listened to it. Immediately, the whole conversation will turn to that. And we'll be talking about the book as an audio book, besides just talking about what was on the page. And I found that interesting because we didn't have that for a very long time. That wasn't
Yeah,
something people really cared about.
yeah, it's
Now
true.
it's easily accessible. I was also talking to somebody. I do a lot of library events where I talk about books that are coming up that I'm excited about that I think will be big. And when you're talking, a lot of libraries are saying that people are not going back into the library because they got so comfortable getting ebooks at home, which is
Mm,
something they hadn't done before. And I'm trying to do a look at a lot of libraries and talk about this. And I'm going to do a little survey. We have a librarian newsletter and just see what's going on. What are the trends that have changed during the pandemic? My cousin had this great line about the pandemic. You took everything out of your basket. Everything got dumped. yoga 6 times a week, this, that, the other thing. All, and now what are you putting back in? And are you putting everything back in exactly the same way? And I think there's a big piece on that of it's not exactly the same way. Patterns have changed of what's going on.
Yeah, I agree, and they've changed, and I think they're continuing to change.
Yes.
The one thing I don't think they'll do is snap back to what they were. But they are continuing to change. Yeah, I mean, I am a reader on the page almost entirely, and it's very rare for me to. There has to be really a reason for me to listen to an audiobook. And I don't unless I'm skimming something for work reasons. That's maybe when I would, read it on my iPad, but then I don't consider it reading when I'm for me, because I can't slow down when I'm reading on an iPad. I look at screens all day. I compose on screens. I write on screens, and I don't want to. To me, reading is reading for pleasure, or reading, for craft, reading for depth. I want to do with a book in my hands and a pen in my hand too.
Yes, I want to be marking pages. I want to be doing what I need to do, because I'm going to want to come back. Because remember, I read this book earlier. We didn't get a chance to do this till now, but I knew the questions. I knew what I wanted to go back because I had my pages marked. So what's next for you? What are you doing next, or what are you working on?
So I'm working on the TV pilot for Signal Fires, which is very absorbing and very exciting, because for many reasons, but one is that I don't have to let go of these characters right now.
Right.
And I get to open them up and not reimagine them, but sort of open them up into, sort of other aspects of their lives, and in a way that the form of writing a TV series would dictate. So right now, that's what I'm doing. I also wrote before I went back to Signal. Wait, is that right? Well, no, I was hired to write it, and then I didn't write it until I finished the novel. Sue Miller's last novel, Monogamy.
Yes.
I adapted as a feature film.
Oh, fabulous.
And that actually is proceeding. So hopefully that will be coming to theaters, and so like interest and the podcast. So I'm in no rush in terms of the next book, because it's always been true for me that I have to wait for it. I can't, anytime I've tried to force something, that's when it doesn't work. Although when I'm writing a book is truly when I'm at my most at peace, and my most connected, and my most alive. So I look forward to when that happens.
So when you're writing for screenplays now, or you're writing for the screen, is it something, was Monogamy the first book you did it with, and this is the second? Like, is it a whole different skill set that you're working from, that you're doing this?
It is a different skill set. It's still storytelling, but it's a different kind of storytelling. And I think the thing that gave me the sense that maybe I could do it was two things. One is that I created a podcast. I didn't know how to do that. And I really went into it going, how do you do that? How do you, I started listening to podcasts. I started noticing what I liked and what I didn't. And then I started interrogating that and wondering why. But the other reason, probably the bigger reason, is that my husband is a filmmaker, and a screenwriter, and I've been reading his scripts for 25 years, and watching films with him and watching TV with him, and up until now, I never had the urge. But I think when I read Monogamy during the pandemic, I wasn't looking for it. I read it actually because Sue Miller's publicist had gotten in touch, because her book was coming out during COVID, and they were asking me if I would be a conversation partner with her. And that's why I had a galley, and that's why I was reading it. But it was a book that broke a dry spell of reading that I think many of us felt at the beginning of the pandemic. I certainly did. I just did not have the concentration to read big fat novels. And then suddenly I was reading this novel and kept on wanting to get back to it and find out what happened. It was very compelling. And at some point I thought, this really, I see the movie in this. So
Mhm.
that's how that happened. But it is a different skill set. It's not less challenging. It's just completely different.
Mhm.
It,
Mhm.
it's writing and visualizing and like seeing in pictures, rather than the words being the sort of what illuminates the path.
Mhm. You don't need, you can do it in a glance or a gesture, what you'd have to put on the page and do a paragraph
Yeah,
or a sentence. And you
yeah,
can just sit there and dismiss somebody really fast just by looking at them or doing something like that.
yeah,
So,
yeah, or just shifting a camera angle, or
yes.
yeah. So I'm enjoying it, and I look forward to when I go back to whatever my next book is.
The next thing. Well, I look forward to seeing the next thing as well. I'm going to go back because I didn't read the thing before this. So I at least have something to do some catching up. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. Everyone said I was going to enjoy talking to you at the publishing house, and they were dead on correct because it's been such a fascinating conversation about a book I loved.
Oh, well, that means so much to me, and I so enjoyed talking with you too.
So, so to our readers, we look forward to seeing you next time on Book Reporter Talks to You. Make sure you read Signal Fires, and I want to hear your comments about it as well. And we'll be back next time with our next Book Reporter Talks to You interview. Bye bye, everyone.